Is God not responsible for creating the serpent that tempted Eve, causing sin to supposedly enter the world? That's not to absolve her of moral responsibility for violating God's commandment not to eat of the tree, but think about it. Ken is responding here to the problem of evil and suffering by saying that the world is not as God made it. So surely he means one of two things. He might mean that the world as God created it contained no evil, or he may mean that it contained no suffering, that these things only pervade the world because of Adam and Eve's sin. Well, if the world as God made it contained no evil, then how did it contain within it an evil, deceptive serpent? It seems to me like evil did exist in the Garden of Eden before any man ever sinned. Indeed, it must have, because otherwise there would have been no evil to tempt Eve, and thus no fall.
Now, Alex, in his arguments against the early chapters in Genesis, is getting at one of the most classic problems that Christians face and Christian theology has to deal with, particularly against skeptics, which is the problem of evil. And he's asking this question particularly as it relates to the presence of the serpent in the garden. And this is part of Alex's larger critique of the early chapters in Genesis, where he's essentially arguing that there was nothing changed with Adam and Eve's sin, that the world was always the way it was.
Is this not the world as God made it?
Now, this is actually part two in responding to Alex's critiques in the early chapters in Genesis. In the first part, I dealt with the way in which Alex spoke about the propensity to sin, suffering, and death. And in the early chapters in Genesis, Alex is arguing that the propensity to sin, suffering, and death were actually not new, even according to Genesis, and I've shown that that is not the case. But one of the things that really deserves its own video and attention as its own topic is the question of how are we to understand the serpent in the garden if God made all things good? It seems like there is already some kind of evil in the garden beforehand. So the first question that we need to ask then is it the case that the serpent was actually evil? And that answer is clearly yes. The serpent was not merely a serpent, and we can actually tell this even from the early chapters in Genesis itself. Even from Genesis chapter 3, the early part, we can clearly see that the serpent is more than just merely a serpent. I've given arguments for this in a video where I've given an interpretation of Genesis chapter 3:15, so you can check out the video there if you want the full argument for that. But suffice it to say, the Bible interprets the serpent in Genesis chapter 3 as the devil. And this is what we get from Revelation chapter 12, Romans chapter 16, and other places as well. And this is what we recognize as what Genesis is teaching. So in the garden, as the serpent is approaching Eve, it actually is the case that it is the devil approaching Eve, and the devil is clearly wicked. So the idea is that it is right to say that there is, in this sense, evil in the garden even before Adam and Eve sin. So in what sense then can we say that evil enters the world through Adam and Eve's sin? So one question that may be helpful for us to understand the question of where this evil came from is to ask where the serpent came from, or more particularly, where did the devil come from? How did the devil become evil? And this is where we see it from the rest of the scriptures that, again, what Ken Ham is saying is correct. God did not make the world as it is. This even applies to Satan himself. Satan was not made bad. He was actually made good and then became evil, wicked, corrupt when he sinned. That is to say, even Satan in this sense was made good, but in a way that was mutable. So the world then underwent a change, or at least it underwent a change for Satan when he sinned and fell. And that is where we would get then the idea of there being evil in the garden. Was there evil in the garden? Yes, without question. But it wasn't an evil that God had put there by virtue of creation. It was because of Satan's fall that there was evil in the garden. Therefore, Eve was tempted. But there's another important way in which we could say that even with regard to the garden, that it was in this sense perfect and good. When we consider the difference between Satan's sin and his fall, and compare that to Adam's sin and his fall. When Satan sinned and fell, it affected only him and all the angels that followed him, which are the demons. It did not corrupt the entire world. It didn't corrupt the entire cosmos. However, the same cannot be said for Adam's sin. When Adam sinned, the entire world was actually corrupted. The entire world, as Paul teaches in Romans chapter 8, is in bondage to decay. But that bondage to decay is not the result of Satan's sin. It is the result of Adam's sin. That is to say, Adam bore a special relationship to the cosmos as the one who is made in the image of God and charged to rule and subdue it. That was different from Satan's relationship to the cosmos. And so what we could say is, before Adam and Eve sinned, the world in this sense was perfect. The only kind of evil that was in the world was the evil of those who chose to sin on their own. That would be Satan and all the angels that followed him, which are the demons. But the garden itself was still good. The world itself was still good. The world was uncorrupted by the sin of Satan. Satan, you could say, corrupted the world not through his own sin, but by tempting Adam and Eve to sin. The world is not the way God made it now. It has been changed as a result of the fall. Now, you could say, well, this may be an answer to this particular question, but this just kind of kicks the can down the road, because we have to deal with the question of, why is there evil at all? Why is there evil at all in the good creation that God has made? Now, this is not quite the question that Alex is asking with regard to the fall in the early chapters in Genesis, but it is one that naturally flows from this. So how are we to think about this? There are two things in particular that we need to keep in mind that are helpful for us to understand this idea of there being evil in the world, even though God made all things good and is sovereign over all things. First, God is the one who ordains all things, that would include sin, but he is able sovereignly to overrule sin so that he can use it for good and holy ends. So God does in fact ordain sin, but he does so without being the author of evil. That is to say, his relationship to sin is such that he overrules it, again, for good ends. Now, this may be a strange thing to think about. You might think, well, that's a contradiction, but a few examples may be helpful to clarify this from the scriptures. You think of what Isaiah describes in Isaiah chapter 10 with the Assyrians and the relationship that they bear to the Israelites. He describes the Assyrians as being evil and wicked. They hate God. They exalt themselves over God. And in that capacity, they are coming against the Israelites, the people of God, and they're trying to destroy them. So they are coming with murder in their hearts. They would be guilty for that. But then we are also told in the context of Isaiah chapter 10 that God is actually using the Assyrians for good for his people, because he is able to overrule their actions, to use it as a kind of discipline on his people to bring them to himself once again. So there are two different kinds of actions, you could say, that are being done in the one act of the Assyrians coming against the Israelites. They are coming to murder. God is overruling their desire to murder for good and holy ends. And it's in this context then we get the very great and famous statement from Isaiah chapter 10, verse 15, speaking to the Assyrians, where he says, "Shall the axe boast over him who hews with it, or the saw magnify itself against him who wields it? As if a rod should wield him who lifts it, or as if a staff should lift him who is not wood." The idea here is that the Assyrians are instruments in the hand of God. Now, the fact that the instrument itself has a different intention with regard to its actions than the one who is wielding it is in no way impugns the motives or in no way makes guilty the one who is wielding the instrument. That is to say, the instrument might be trying to murder, but God is actually using it for the sake of good and holy ends, and he is doing that in a way that is righteous. Now, another example that is really the greatest example, the greatest demonstration of this principle is with Christ himself. You think of what happens when he is put to death. There are evil and wicked men that seek to put him to death, violating the commandments of God, doing that which he hates, doing that which is contrary to his will, and for which they receive a just sentence of condemnation, and even why God came in judgment in 70 AD and destroyed the temple. It was because of their sins that God was displeased with. And yet, what was God doing in that act where they are putting to death the Son of God? God was at the same time acting, and he was yet doing it to save the entire world, because it is through Christ now that people from every nation, tribe, and tongue, that is to say, an elect people from all over the world, are in fact coming to God and being saved. The foundation of their salvation is in fact the death of Christ. Now, those who are putting him to death had no intention of this, and yet that was the result. And God is not, in this sense, actively slaying his son in the same way that we would think about, someone who was trying to murder somebody is doing. He is using the acts of sinful men for holy ends. He is able to overrule it, yet without sin. We would say that it would be that is even a demonstration of God's righteousness, that he is using the death of his son in order to bring about the salvation of the world. That is actually a demonstration of God's righteousness, even though those who were committing the act, the humans who were committing the act, were doing so sinfully. So the first principle is that God is actually able to overrule sin for good and holy ends. He does sovereignly do it, and it is good. He is able to, in this sense, be sovereign over sin, yet without sinning himself. And the second thing we need to keep in mind is that when it comes to God's relationship to sin, that God, in this sense, you could say, causes sin, but in such a way that he is not guilty of it. That is to say, the way in which sin is caused or ordained or even executed is by God is not that he would do it. So the idea is that God, the first sin and even all sins are decreed by God, and that's in that sense you could say God is the cause of it in the sense of the first cause of it, but yet not in such a way that God is actually doing it. In that sense, we'd say that he is not the author of sins. We get an expression that helps us in Romans chapter 1 with regard to this, like different ways in which a thing could be a cause of another thing. In Romans 1, Paul speaks about what God does to those who turn away from him, and says that God actually gives them over to their sins. So God hands over the wicked to their sins. That is to say, essentially, he causes them to sin further by letting them go. And in this sense, you could see, well, God is not unrighteous as he is causing others to sin, because he is doing it in a way that it's just letting them do what they would otherwise do. This is a removal of a restraint as a method for causing sin doesn't mean that the one who's removing the restraint is actually guilty. As an example of this, an example, and realizing that all analogies are going to fall short in some way, but in a way that can get at this principle in a way that would help us to make sense of at least the general principles I'm talking about. If a person is holding a door against a burglar, okay, he's holding the door against the burglar's banging on the door trying to get in. Let's say that for some reason, the person holding the door against the burglar is unable to hold the door or doesn't hold the door any further. It would be quite perverse and wrong to say that the person who failed to hold the door against the burglar for whatever reason is guilty of burglary. Clearly, the only person who is guilty of breaking and entering is the one who is breaking and entering. Now, is there a sense in which you could say that the person who is holding the door caused the burglary to happen because he did not hold the door? Yeah, there is a sense in which you could say that, but it's not a sense of causation where you would say that the person holding the door is the author of that sin of burglary. He was a restrainer, you could say, and the restraint was removed, which then caused the person to commit the sin of burglary. And this is what we're saying is happening with God. Even as God ordains sin, the way in which sin is actually executed is in such a way that God is not guilty of it. In Romans 1, the way in which sin actually happens is God gives people over to their sins. This is to say, a restraint is removed. And in doing so, what we could say is that even as we see God foreordaining everything that comes to pass, which includes sin, and even as we see that sins do in fact happen, that the way in which they happen actually is a demonstration of God's righteousness. Because the thing that it shows is that without God, there is no possibility for any of his creatures to stand. That is to say, without God upholding his creatures, all of them would fall into sin. And this is demonstrated with the fall itself. When Adam and Eve were not being supernaturally upheld by God, they fell into sin. And what all this shows then is that mankind, it has an absolute need and dependence on having God be the one who is his refuge and his strength. He has an absolute need on God to sustain him in righteousness, and that there is no hope for his salvation except in this God. If you do not have God and you're left to yourself, you will sin, even if it's the case, as Adam and Eve were, prone to righteousness in a general sense. Yet without the help of God, they eventually did fall into sin. And the hope of the gospel is this, that though death came into the world through sin and all the evil that came with it, the God who is able to overrule all sin and evil for good purposes has in fact sent his Son that there might be life in his name. The message of the gospel, therefore, is this: turn to Christ and live.